What do Russia, North Korea, Belarus and Cuba have in common? They have all been spared Donald Trump's tariffs. From Canada to the Canaries, Poland to penguins, the rest of the international community has suffered from a tax hike of eye-watering proportions. So what can the government here do about it? Indeed, how can economies around the world respond? I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
Well, yet another momentous week driven by the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and over the past 5 or 6 days at least, the headlines being dominated by the greatest tax hike we have seen in over a century. Tariffs have been placed on almost every country across the globe. It's not just people who are suffering. Penguins have been hit with the tariff as well on an island where no residents live, but Donald decided that they needed to be smacked as well. I'm not sure what he's got against penguins, but maybe we'll find out as the conversations go on. The stock markets have taken huge tumbles, and of course, it has caused chaos across economies, with China, which is the biggest hit country as far as Trump's tariffs were concerned, hitting back like for like, and that has sent shockwaves right across the globe, because I think it was anticipated that China may be a little more relaxed in their approach and their response. For the UK's part, well, Keir Starmer remains cool, calm and collected. He's not made any signs as yet as to retaliatory tariffs against the United States, although moves are afoot to support British industries, and there has been an announcement this morning about the car manufacturing industry, which I'm sure we'll get into during the course of the conversation. What else can the UK government do? Well, we're hearing that some of the big infrastructure investments and programmes and those reforms to planning are going to be accelerated. Hopefully, they are having back-channel conversations with other countries, particularly, I would suggest, the European Union, in terms of getting better trade deals in place to protect the UK from this huge hit. But overall, every economist that you will hear, and among them Trump supporters, are saying this is a disaster, potentially an absolute catastrophe for the world economy. So, Jim, what is Donald Trump thinking? Is he going to back down? Is he going to U-turn? Is he going to, in 7 days, say, well, enough countries have come to the White House and bent the knee, so it means that I can take some of these tariffs off? Or are we facing the catastrophe that, as I say, many economists are predicting?
Well, on the question of permanence, initially, I think people thought it was a negotiating position, but it has become clear over the weekend that this is, as far as he is concerned, permanent. People thought that he was very susceptible to changes in the markets. That was the only thing that he listened to, but it's become clear that he's not influenced by that. His short-term pain for long-term gain. It's quite possible that he'll do individual deals. I mean, for instance, slightly bizarrely, he has put tariffs on Israel. Netanyahu is going to the White House today or tomorrow, and one would expect that Israel will be let off on an individual basis. But what I've sorry to go to the sort of the really wide view about this, but I think I will, and just see what you have got to say about it. Is the question of whether this is the end of globalization. That process, which over the last 40 years has seen companies and countries deciding where things can be made cheapest, and it has led to the catastrophic loss of manufacturing jobs in the old countries of in the United States and here, particularly in the north of England. We saw it going right back to the 1970s, the loss of the textile industry, that sort of thing. And the benefits of it have been that it's obviously massively improved the economies of some of those third world countries, particularly in Southeast Asia. But of course, it did have consequences in this country and in America. And people have been saying that you can theorize about the benefits of globalization in general terms, but eventually the people who are hit in those old economies in the rust belts of the north of England and Pennsylvania and places like that are liable to hit back. And without being too sort of pompous about it, you can see that Brexit was our example, and Trumpism is the example in the United States, and possibly Mrs. Le Pen, which we're going to come on to later on, in France. So this is, if this is the end of globalization, the idea that we should rebuild our manufacturing, that we should make things in our own countries in an unstable world, perhaps there's something in it. It certainly is explicable. But of course, the disruption that's going to be caused, and particularly difficult for this Labour government, which was on such fine margins following the spring statement, which was immediately blown out of the water. There may be opportunities if interest rates come down. Some people will be able to take advantage of that, and so on. But it's a very turbulent time. But I'm just in this discussion, I'm going to try and not catastrophize. I mean, you guys can do what you want to do. I'm just thinking we've got to find our way through it. And frankly, if the United States doesn't want to cooperate on defense and on trade and things like that, we've got to find an alternative. And whether that's with our European partners or with deals around the world, there may be a way around this. So I'm just going to try and get shreds of optimism from this highly volatile situation. I mean, I don't see him being brought down in the United States. There were one or two people. I mean, Musk's behavior is really weird. He was talking about a tariff-free relationship between the EU and America on Saturday. I mean, as his short political career seems to be coming to an end, he seems to be getting more and more bizarre. But it's a complicated picture. But I just think, there may be some shreds of optimism. But please call me naive if you wish.
No, it just sounds to me as though you've been drinking the Kool-Aid, Jim, but it's a good analysis. And I think it, to be fair, allows us to at least get a lens into the thinking of the Trump regime. And of course, this is the narrative that has been basically put forward by many populists across the world, that globalization is killing countries, ignoring the fact that, of course, that we are now, generally speaking, all better off than we've ever been, ignoring the fact that for 80 years, by and large, we've lived in a world of peace. I know we've had skirmishes in certain parts of the world, but we haven't had the world wars that we've seen during the 30s and the 40s. And the frightening thing about, you look back at history, what tariffs and depressions have done in the past is they have driven to world wars, and that has got to be our surely biggest fear. What happens to the economy will happen, but if we all end up with countries feeling so poor, so exposed, that they feel that taking up arms is the only way in which they can actually face this challenge, then I'm afraid we are all going to hell in a handcart. And I think that the fact that Trump has introduced these tariffs in such a mean-spirited way, hitting some of the very poorest countries in the world, forget Europe, forget the UK for a moment, basically placing tariffs on African nations whose almost entire economy is propped up by exports to the United States. Of course, they are not in a position where they can have dual trade because people in those countries simply can't afford American goods. You're not going to get people in certain parts of Africa buying bloody Cadillacs, for God's sake. And again, you go back to what he's doing to his own domestic economy. Well, the last time I looked, Americans quite like their coffee. Well, they don't produce coffee other than in Hawaii. It's about 3% of their product over there that they produce. They don't produce bananas. So, there's lots of these things that don't make any sense, whatever your analysis of that term globalization is. And what I would argue, you see, is globalization has not necessarily been the problem. It's the way in which we've reacted to globalization and not supported the most vulnerable and the poorest citizens within our countries. And what you hear from all these commentators who are now saying, oh, it's all globalization, it's because we've closed factories, it's because we haven't got coal mines. Not sure I want my kids going down the mines, by the way. But when you try and tax the rich and the people at the top, they're the first people to come out and say, whoa, you're going to kill the economy. You can't do that. So where do governments go? They go to those poor people again and start cutting welfare, as we discussed last week. So I think it's a simplistic argument, and it's a powerful one, because those people who do feel excluded are always looking for something and someone to blame. But I'm not sure the analysis is necessarily accurate. Joe, I don't know what your feelings on this are. Just before you speak, breaking news, UK stock markets down 6% so far. So a good start to the day if you're a trader.
Yes, I was just about to say that, and they've plunged a lot overnight on the Asia markets as well. Goldman Sachs have just upped the risk of US recession to 45%. And, there is no doubt it is going to play havoc with people. I mean, the thing about Trump, as we endlessly say, along with everybody else, is he's so unpredictable. Apparently, he sort of worked this out on the back of a crisp packet or something. And it was sort of like, divide it by 2, put in your mother's birthday, pick a number, any number, and that'll be it. And all economists, even the most sort of guarded and diplomatic, are going, well, that's not quite how I would have done it. And the problem is that even if he is absolutely sticking to this, we know he won't, because he'll probably do a deal, as you say, with Netanyahu. He might do a different deal with the UK. He might do something different with the next person he speaks to, and then change it all again next week. And the problem for businesses and investors is they need security and they need stability. And the one thing that Trump is bringing is instability on a massive scale. I mean, there is a part of me that thinks, I wish we could all stop bloody well talking about him, because all the time we're looking over there and looking at the nonsense. We're not looking at what else is going on. And I think you're absolutely right, Frank, that, we're not looking properly at the impact that what Trump is doing is having, whether it's about cutting aid, cutting medicines and vaccines. The second child has died of measles in Texas. Robert Kennedy Jr. turned up at its funeral. This is a guy who thinks cod liver oil can cure measles. The cuts to medicine, to science, to academia, to the arts, to the creative industry, those are the things that also make globalization good. It is sharing the cultures, sharing music, sharing fashion, sharing ideas, all of those things, which have made globalization a force for good. We wouldn't know that malaria was an easily curable disease but kills more children on the planet than anything else if it wasn't for the involvement of people in a global world. But this isolationist approach to tariffs and business is so damaging. And of course, the elephant in the room is, if you do that to countries who have got nothing to fight back with, as you rightly say, Frank, what do you fight back with? You fight back with terror.
Yeah.
And war.
And of course, all of these countries, and this is the big sort of bafflement of Trump's approach in his second term. His first term, and throughout his political campaign and career, really, the big enemy has been China. What he's doing with this policy is forcing many of those African nations into the arms of the Chinese, because that is the superpower where they are most likely to look in terms of future support. I think, to be fair, Jim, you're not the only one that is saying globalization, this is the beginning of the end, because Darren Jones was hitting the television studios over the weekend. I'm not quite sure he said globalization is coming to an end, but he certainly said we've got to look at the way in which we manage economies differently in this new world, I suppose you'd call it, of isolationism. What I would be saying to Darren Jones and his colleagues, though, Keir Starmer et al., is if America wants to be isolated, let them be isolated. Why aren't we calling conventions of countries who do wish to continue to collaborate, cooperate, and work in partnership? Why aren't we, as I say, creating an environment where new trade deals can be done more quickly? And I tell you, the biggest laugh I had this week since the tariff announcements was this gaslighting that Brexiteers were trying to do to the country, suggesting that in some way we should be thankful that the UK has only got a 10% tariff placed on it. Well, actually not quite true, because our car manufacturers have had a 25% hit, and that by far is the biggest and most damaging targeted tax that the UK PLC has been hit with. But let's not forget, we were promised by those same Brexiteers, easiest trade deal in the world would be done with the EU. United States and literally hundreds of other countries would be lining up to do free trade deals with the UK. Well, none of that has come to pass. And here they are celebrating, salivating, some of them, over a 10% increase on UK trade with a country, by the way, that we have a trade deficit with. So this, again, idea that Trump is trying to promote, to say, well, these taxes are going on all these countries that we have a trade deficit, absolute nonsense. We have a trade deficit with the United States. So why don't we actually, Jim, get to a point where we start to drive the agenda and simply turn ourselves into a country that does apparently have all these levers available to us now, begin conversations in a serious way with the European Union, with India, with China, and get some trade deals done outside of the United States?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously very predictable that the Brexiteers would latch on to this differential between what we're being tariffed and what they're being tariffed. The underlying eternal truth is that us leaving the European Union has cost the British economy 4% in GDP, and that's been going on since 2020, and it is permanently there. The answer is, I think broadly our trade with the United States is fairly even, actually. And this is the problem for the UK.
3% down last year, Jim.
Oh, really? Was it? Well, I think it varies, but it goes some ways one side, some ways the other. But this is the huge dilemma for Starmer. He is trying to walk this tightrope, and I've thought for some days now that at some point the European Union are going to ask us to take a lane, as the new expression is, and it's going to be very difficult. I mean, Starmer's got a lot of credit for trying to do this. Because he doesn't want to completely alienate the United States and a politician with which he has very little in common. And so the fact that we're still talking is a tribute in a way to Starmer. But, in the meantime, we want to do deals with the European Union. I mean, there's some scratchiness over Macron excluding us from defence contracts. So we want things from the European Union. But at some point, as they suffer 20%, they're going to ask us to decide. And of course, in going back over British foreign policy over centuries, our aim has always been to sort of balance between the wide open sea and our European friends. Indeed, that was the problem about our relationship with the European Union. And Starmer's in that tradition in a way. He still hopes that he can get some tangible concessions from Trump, and then show that to the British people. But of course, that will have an adverse reaction in the European Union. It's an extremely difficult balancing act that Starmer's trying to do. Just while I'm speaking, just to mention one or two other things, I just want to support what you're saying about, of course, America cutting its foreign aid and then slapping these tariffs on these poor countries in Southeast Asia and Africa. And you're absolutely right. Russia and China, who are already aggressively going in there, will be just taking up the slack and supporting those countries. And those countries are bound to conclude that that's where their help is coming from. So it really does look like isolationist America, that he's not bothered about that. And the final point is that I would just say that in an unstable world, do you not see real benefits in repatriating some basic industries? I mean, for instance, let me just put it out there. Wouldn't it be a good idea if we made washing machines and fridges again in this country with what could be unstable trade lines? Wouldn't that be a good idea? And this is why I'm saying that there could be some benefits in this, and the people in the Red Wall who lost their jobs over the years. I mean, obviously there'd be the question of how competitively we could make these things.
That's the problem, though, Jim.
That is the problem,
this, this is the genius out the bottle. So, I was horrified to read over the weekend about our steel manufacturing plant, one of the last ones potentially being closed, and it is horrifying. But to think that you can turn the clock back and have 1950s Britain back again, or 1950s America back again, I'm afraid is for the birds, because we would not be able to manufacture clothes. We would not be able to manufacture those white goods that you talked about in the efficient way, or some would say the slave labor way, they do in other countries. And we have become, basically, as a consumer base, absolutely reliant upon these cheap goods. So the very people, Jim, who we would say, and to some extent justifiably so, have been hit by globalization, would be the first to scream and indeed be penalized because of hugely increased costs if we decided to go down that route. So it sounds great, doesn't it? Let's just open all the factories up again.
Yeah.
In fact, let's start fracking in Lancashire and get people on the job there. Wouldn't be a bad idea in my view, but let's not go there. But you can see the problem, Jim, can't you? We are never going to be able to produce goods as cheaply as they do in those South Asian and other parts of the world countries, are we? We just can't, Joe.
Yes, I'm probably just on fridges. So probably that's a stretch too far. But I really do believe we need to keep steel production in this country, and I do believe that with our defence budgets going up, the arms that we make really have to be made in Britain. If you and all the technology that goes around that for security reasons, quite apart from economic reasons. Sorry, Joe.
Well, I mean, yes, I completely agree with Frank. It's bonkers to think we're going to suddenly have cotton mills and people sitting on treadle sewing machines making things like that. It's not going to happen. What we do have to do, and it was where we have got quite a head start actually, and it is where the government has been talking about but has yet to actually put the money where the mouth is in the field of things like life sciences. And you only have to walk around Liverpool, around the university quarter, and you see the work that is going on and the fantastic academic institutions there. And it really, I know I've said this before on this podcast, but it really is now up to the government to force universities to stop fannying around and actually get some quick, efficient courses. Stop doing 2-3 years in art, history of art, which is lovely and great. We're on a semi-war footing. We need to be training people to do the things that we can then sell. And what we can sell is knowledge. And whether that is in medicine, whether it's in cybersecurity, whether it's in engineering or science, those are the things that the future will require, particularly as you see America hitting back on all of these things and withdrawing funding. The one thing I would just like to go back on the point that you made about Starmer walking a tightrope. The tightrope is not just between Europe and America. The tightrope is here at home, where we've already seen this morning the announcement that actually there's going to be a little bit of breathing space for the car manufacturing industry and a pullback on the move away from petrol vehicles, on the fines and things like that. But at the same time, we see Rachel Reeves has kept all of those things in, all of those wonderful city bonuses that Liz Truss brought in. So, we've got mixed messaging on the environment with the answer saying, well, no, we're in a crisis. We've got to be less green in order to keep some jobs and keep some industries going. But we haven't got a chancellor that was willing last week, as we all urged her to do, to say, things have changed, I'm changing my rules. And today, pensioners are getting an increase of over 4% in their state pension. People on benefits get one below 2%. It ain't a fair country, and that's what Labour should be up to.
I wonder why Jim was so chipper. 4% increase rate at the bloody hell.
He's got a new lampshade, I think.
That's not bad, is it? 4%. I let's come back to the domestic policy then, and what the government might do. I mean, as I say, what I would be urging Keir Starmer and co to do is open up those negotiations far more urgently now with the European Union, with India, with other big trading blocs. As I say, I wouldn't be opposed to opening conversations with China. We know the controversy surrounding that, of course, but at least you know where China is coming from. And I'm not convinced that China's human rights record, as bad as it is going to compare that unfavourably with MAGAs if they stay in charge of America for a decade or so, because some of the things that are happening in the States, as Joe alluded to, are absolutely frightening, actually. We'll probably touch upon that next week rather than this week, because there is so much happening there that is going under the radar that, as I say, the only word I can use is frightening. But for me, yes, some of these tweaks at home, I think car manufacturers do need help. So will this announcement in terms of rowing back a little on the green agenda help? Probably will. They've already announced, of course, JLR, Jaguar Land Rover, that they will be pausing their sales to the United States at least for 6 weeks. And that could, of course, potentially lead to some job losses in the short to medium term. So I think the government have got to start to take some action as far as that is concerned. The point you make about life sciences, Joe, is a good one. The other thing, of course, that we export more of than almost any other country in the world, it is basically professional services. Exactly. And so that is something that we can continue to do.
Which are not affected by tariffs, of course.
Correct. And surely now, the last point that you made there, Joe, Rachel Reeves will free herself from these daft fiscal rules that she's basically put herself in a straitjacket over. So, Jim, there are levers that our government can pull. It is going to be challenging because we are talking here, let's face it, about the biggest economy in the world trying to close themselves off from the rest of us. But as with all challenges, there are opportunities, and I think there's some of them. Free yourself from your fiscal rules, start to invest in your own industries, some of which you've talked about this morning as well, and start getting some of these bloody trade talks and trade deals over the line.
Yes. I mean, just to add to my list, along with steel, is solar panels. And in this lovely weather we've been having, I saw a stat last week which showed that the contribution of solar energy to the grid was quite spectacular. Now, we can't expect this weather to carry on forever, but certainly things like that, I don't see any harm in us. I'm talking about making things, and you've justly rebuked me over washing machines, things like that. But I think with some of the green industries, some of the manufacturing of that could be done here. I want to let's lock horns on China. I understand you're quite right. We reach out to India and countries like that, but let's just examine your proposition that we go back to Osborne and Cameron's attitude to China. The fact of the matter is that China has been engaged in intellectual sabotage of this country through university students and spying on us and things like that. They sanction a lot of our members of parliament for things that they've said about the persecution of the Uyghur people. They are very prone to stealing our ideas and then selling us back goods at a cheaper rate. There's quite a possibility now with all this turmoil that they'll be trying to dump products in this country. It is a very tempting proposition, and I'm not naive about this because we've just discussed this many times about our pragmatic, in inverted commas, approach to, for instance, Saudi Arabia, where because they've got the money, we compromise a great deal. So I'm not disagreeing with you, but I'm just saying that a lot of people are going to find it unacceptable for us to get too close to China, even in these really difficult times.
Do you not think, though, Jim, that you mention all of those things that China has done to the UK, that you now look at the United States and think, what's coming down the tracks from them? I mean, it's not as if we've had a balanced and fair relationship with the United States since the Second World War. We've been screwed by consecutive presidents. It's just that this fella is screwing us in every orifice. So what do you think the benefits of continuing a special relationship with the United States are? Because quite frankly, James, I'm struggling to see what benefits we get these days. And we can't even now say that we are supporting the bastion, the beacon of democracy. Because, as I say, some of the things that the Trump government is up to under the radar is making my hair curl. So what are you suggesting the difference between China and the States is? Is it because over the years America have seemed to be the good guys, even though we know that on occasion they screw countries across the world as well? Or are we saying that over the next 10 years, Trump and MAGA are going to somehow get de-elected, deselected? Because I tell you, I can see coming down the line a real attack on American democracy. It's already happening, isn't it? So what are you trying to say in terms of the difference between those relationships? Or are you saying we should ignore America and detach ourselves, decouple ourselves from those relationships, but then basically try and decouple ourselves from the biggest trade, the other big trading bloc and superpower, China, as well?
You are right to draw our attention to some unwelcome developments and some questions that the Trump administration and some challenges that the Trump administration is making to American democracy. I mean, the most spectacular of those was when he sent his thugs into the Capitol in 2020. But there is still, even under a Trumpian United States, a great deal of difference between America and China. I'm not aware that the United States has been in sending its students to universities to engage in intellectual sabotage. I'm not aware that the United States has sanctioned our MPs. We are still in a military alliance with the United States, whereas China...
I don't think that one might be far away.
Well, we'll see. A military alliance with the United States, whereas in China we have huge challenges in the South China Sea. And I'm not aware that we gave one of our colonies away under the promises of keeping liberal values in Hong Kong that were flagrantly violated. So I think there's still a great deal of difference between even Trumpian America and China.
I think you're being a bit kind to Trumpian America, Jim. I think a lot of those things could come to pass. I mean, Greenland wouldn't necessarily agree with your analysis. Didn't one American President Reagan invade Grenada as well, one of the Commonwealth countries, without even informing us? So, listen, I'm not in any way seriously trying to suggest that China has all of a sudden become this bastion that we ought to be cozying up to. But the idea that we should cut them off as a potential trading partner, I think would just be economic suicide, to be fair. So I think we've got to have those conversations. And I think if nothing else, Joe,
I've not said cut them off,
this
Frank.
is
I've just
about
said be
trying
very cautious,
Yeah, but
and
I
be
think
aware that for a lot of people, we'll be crossing a moral threshold if we got too close to them.
I
That's
think
what
that
I'm
went
saying.
a long time ago, Jim. If you look at some of the investments that we've taken in this country from, as you mentioned, Saudi, where's your, come on, where's your moral compass? We're still supplying arms to Israel, for God's
Yeah,
sake.
exactly.
Look what they're up to. So I think the moral argument's definitely gone out of the window. The points that you make about China are absolutely fair. But what I'm saying is I don't think that in America right now, or for the foreseeable future, we have a stable partner. And I suppose what we're asking ourselves and struggling with, and us three are doing this, aren't we, as we have the conversation, is how's the best way to handle a bully? That's what we're
Well,
basically saying.
there are those that would say, and I think most of us would intellectually agree, you stand up to a bully. That's the way you actually deal with them. But we can't, because we've got too many other things going on. And I think, I think Keir Starmer has played it absolutely right by being diplomatic, calm, cautious, not, lashing out. Probably too cautious for some people. But, we've just seen that Hong Kong Stock Exchange has closed down 13%, worst trading day since 1997. And oil prices have fallen to the lowest level in 4 years. This is only going to go on. And you only need something else, like the earthquake that happened last week in Myanmar, or something else happened somewhere. And the global stocks, the global economy will collapse. I mean, we've already seen a run on gold. Government bonds are absolutely going through the roof. That's a good thing for people of doing that. But it's going to have huge impact. And this is, we know we're still paying the price for the financial crash of 2008. Then COVID. Now we get this, but this one is self-inflicted by Donald Trump. And hang on a minute, just let me just finish, because I think that what we have to do, and this is where the tightrope comes back in, we need to spread our bets across the people we can trade with. And it's not America or China, it's China and America. But it has got to be, above all, it's got to be with Europe. And I think if you ask the British people, who do we deal with in order to beat the tariffs, they would say Europe, because we can trust them more than we can trust the orange man in the White House.
I just wanted to come in on this. Did you say oil prices have come down a lot this morning?
Yeah.
Well, now that has an interesting sidebar to it, doesn't it? Because what's Vladimir Putin going to make of that? Because the Russian economy is on a tightrope itself, and is depending on reasonably high oil prices. If they're collapsing, then that's going to have huge implications for Russia. But we can't take on too many subjects this one. I mean, let me. 2028 Democratic president of the United States. I just put that in there.
I think the problem
how much difference
I
would
want
it
to
make?
talk about this next week. I'm hoping that Martin Littrott's going to be able to join us next week, our
That'd be
American
good,
correspondent. But honestly, there is talk in America now about the midterms being suspended, about elections being stolen by the Republicans, about legal challenges in any state where a Republican is defeated. So, January 2020 writ large, but across the country, you've seen huge demonstrations over the weekend in every state in America, basically against Trump and, bizarrely, Musk, who, as Joe said, seems to be having a bit of a meltdown at the moment. I think he's not only taking the Kool-Aid, he's taking the ket. But at the end of the day, I am really, really concerned in a genuine way that we are seeing people, not necessarily Donald Trump, but people in and around Donald Trump who have a very, very dark agenda. And if you think that this is going to be sorted out by midterm elections and by a new Democratic president being elected in 4 years' time, what I'm saying, Jim, is I'm not convinced that those elections are going to take place. And even if they do take place, whether they will be fair elections. All sorts of things happening in the courts at the moment, excluding people from voting.
Yeah, excluding
I mean, it's just incredible,
excluding
Jim, what's
journalists from the
happening.
White House. You know, they're banning the press, they're banning universities. And there's a really good article in the New York Times yesterday, which I would urge people to read. And it's about the supplication and the way big law firms and Columbia University are all rolling over in order to keep on side. And they're keeping on side with no promise of anything, because the next one will be, we'll roll over again.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, that is what we should be looking at as we try and deal with this tariffs issue. Yeah, we can roll over to a certain point, but we're not going to roll over.
And we also need to remember that Elon Musk put $20 million into an obscure contest for a judge in Wisconsin against the Democratic candidate.
She won.
And the Democrat won. So let's just easy, boys and girls. I know. I mean, you raise serious
honestly,
issues,
Jim,
Frank,
do you know, you would have been honestly, Jim, you would have been the guy sat in Germany in 1932 saying, "Easy, guys, Adolf's not that bad." This is the playbook of Goebbels.
Yeah,
the press
absolutely.
have been attacked. Private sector, Jim, it's no good nodding your head. These are facts. The press who criticised Trump have been excluded from White House briefings. Lawyer firms that have taken government to court on a whole range of issues have been told by Trump, get back in your box, otherwise we will be coming for you. This is dangerous territory. You're getting people basically taken off the streets and snatched and put on planes without any due process. The administration itself has admitted that it is deported people who should not have been deported, leaving families without fathers. Now, if this was if this was Russia, then you would be absolutely screaming about how appalling this behaviour was. But because it's America, somehow it's like, oh, this will all go away. Well, as I say, in 30s Germany, people said this was all go away. I am very, very concerned that we are heading to an authoritarian America. And at some point, we're going to have to wake up and smell the coffee here, because we're sleepwalking to it again. And it's okay, as I say, saying, oh, well, they won an obscure election. Well, yeah, they did. But do you honestly think, Jim, that with the people around Trump at this moment in time, with the words that are being used by Vance when he visits Greenland, and when he comes to Europe and starts telling us that we are attacking free speech, do you think people like that would give a care for actually having free and fair elections mid-term that would potentially stop the momentum of this MAGA agenda?
I just think that the underlying strength of American democracy will not permit the suspension of the midterm elections in the United States. I think it would be interesting to see when the Supreme Court goes on this, because there have been signs that although the Supreme Court's meant to be in Trump's pocket, I think the senior judge of the Supreme Court did make a speech last week where he did put a shot across the bows of Trump. So
what did the administration say?
Let us see.
What did the administration say? The administration said we will ignore the law.
Yeah, exactly.
And do you honestly think that we are going to see FBI agents storming the White House and arresting the president? And I really think that, as I say, wake up and smell the coffee. I think we are heading into a really, really dangerous phase of American history. And I'm not necessarily saying this is Donald Trump's doing, but read some of the workings.
Project 25.
Project 25. Read that and tell me that you're not scared.
Well, we'll wait and see. I mean, I have to say, you know, in the 1930s, there was quite a pro-Hitler movement in the United States. It's absolutely true. So there is a section of the United States which does have that view, and certainly has an isolationist view, as we've discussed before. I just think I'm happy to take the description of being a sort of naive 1930s Weimar Republic German observer. We'll see. I just slightly overdoing it, but we'll see.
Jim, I see you as one of the Mitford sisters today.
Yes, no, I am concerned. I think some of the things, as I say, that are happening in the States.
I'm with you, Frank. I wouldn't go to America right now.
No, we've got Martin on next week, and Martin usually takes a far more pragmatic view of these things than I do, and we're looking at these things obviously from the outside. But if listeners are exercised by American politics and perhaps want to know a bit more about what's going on, there's a great podcast called Pod Save America, which is well worth a listen. Very balanced as well, not full of Democrats, have a lot of Republican commentators. But when you hear Joe Rogan, who is a huge advocate actually of Donald Trump and has been a big supporter of MAGA in the past, going on to his podcast and saying that America is entering dark days, then I think that's a time when people like us should express some concern. We've been all over the place. We've gone where I didn't want to go, which was America's challenges. We've got enough of our own in the UK. Let's see what the next 7 days brings in terms of our response to the tariffs. I'm sure this will be a conversation that continues. But there have been other things going on, not least over the water in France, where Marine Le Pen has been basically found guilty of embezzlement and therefore disbarred from standing for the next presidential election, of which she was certainly in the running, if not the favourite. So we'll be discussing that and a little bit more when we come back after the break. Okay, welcome back to the second part of this week's Down South End Politics podcast. We're getting very hot under the collar here with conversations about what's happening in America with tariffs, but it may be challenging in the UK, but what's happening in France has been absolutely incredible over the past couple of years, actually, ever since Emmanuel Macron called an unnecessary election and lost it. There's been turmoil with governments being put together, coalitions falling apart, two prime ministers in situ in the past couple of years, starting to mirror what was happening with the UK and the Tory government. But what's happened over the past 7 days has been even more controversial because the favourite to win the next presidential election, Marine Le Pen of National Rally, has been found guilty of embezzlement and therefore barred from running for office. So, is this an absolute godsend for National Rally's political opponents? Or will we see in France the same sort of response that we saw to Donald Trump's indictments? And that is the question that has been asked across Europe over the past few days since this judgment was made. Joe, what's your thinking?
Well, last week I said I thought that the when challenged by Jim, our cosy Nazi apologist, I don't mean that, Jim, really, but he said he thought it would be it would inspire the right to support her and say it was a political. And I said, oh no, I think the French are far too sophisticated. They don't like embezzlement. Actually, I've changed my mind. And I think Jim was right, because I had forgotten at the time that Sarkozy, remember him, is walking around with an ankle tag for his role in embezzlement and fraud or some shenanigans. Now she's come out, Marine Le Pen has come out and said she is the Martin Luther King Jr. of France, which is a pretty broad step to make in anybody's imagination. The Supreme Court didn't have to ban her immediately. And there is a question about whether she can process the appeal quickly enough that she would be able to stand in the presidential election, the next presidential election. But of course, she's got huge support from the right. But we have seen in the past that where they have done well, whether it was Front National and now it's a National Rally. There was an election a couple of years ago, Jim will probably remember exactly when it was, and they had to go again, and it was a sort of like, apathy one, but it put the right ahead. And then on the second ballot, actually everybody went, oh, blimey, we don't want this to happen, so we will go out and vote. I mean, I think, like everywhere in Europe and around the world, there is a huge division between this populist right wing, I'm speaking for you, the forgotten people, even though I've embezzled public money, not for her own pocket, it must be said, but to pay for alleged but not really their assistance and aid. I mean, it's the sort of thing here we'd be all hot under the collar about, and there'd be an inquiry, and about 6 months later somebody would resign and then reappear on a non-executive directorship. So it is a big deal, but I sort of think that there is so much going on in Europe regarding Ukraine, regarding tariffs, regarding the tumult in Turkey, and what else is going on in Hungary, pulling out of the International Criminal Court last week because Netanyahu was going there, because if they hadn't, he'd have had to be arrested. Everywhere seems to be in turmoil, and I'm not sure that people have got the appetite for, Marine Le Pen becoming Martin Luther King.
Jim, I think that the courts have overstretched here. The more I read about this case, the more I thought that the judgment was far too harsh. I'm not necessarily saying she wasn't guilty. I'm sure, in fact, she absolutely was guilty. But we talk about embezzlement. Let's make this clear. It's basically they were taking funds from the European Union, and rather than use them for parliamentary work, European parliamentary work, the staff that they were paying with these funds were basically campaigning for Front National within the French elections and in the run-up to French elections. Now, what many MEPs, former MEPs, have said, rightly or wrongly, is that this happens all the time. They're not the only ones, and although it was quite a large amount of funds, £3 million, I think, was the amount that was stated, this was not that big a deal. And as I say, the punishment doesn't necessarily fit the crime. What do you reckon?
I think that it was a serious matter, but I have to acknowledge that it was the extreme end of what the judge could do. So moving on from that to what I think is likely to happen, they have already agreed to accelerate the appeal process, because there was a chance that with the sluggish nature of French justice, that just by process reasons, the appeal might not have been heard until after the presidential elections, and that would clearly have been unsatisfactory. So they have agreed to bring the appeal forward, and then we come to justice versus pragmatism, and I believe that the appeal court will allow her to stand, because I think there is this perception that the French people should be allowed to have the choice that they want. And in that election, you've already alluded to it, as happens in every election, the far right do very well in the first round of presidential elections, and then the French people look at it and say, we don't want that person, and then they lose out to Macron, whoever it might be. Now, of course, it may be in these troubled times that doesn't happen this time. The other thing that's quite interesting is that if I'm wrong about these things, I still think the Front National will present a huge challenge, because we do have this Jordan Bardella, who's the president of National Rally, who's effectively her deputy, who's a very charismatic man, but very inexperienced. And I think this is what Mrs. Le Pen is concerned about. And it's been quite noticeable that people have sort of said to her, well, you've got a young man there, he can do it. And she's been studiously not saying that was an alternative strategy. Because I think she thinks that his inexperience would prevent him winning. So that's what I think will happen, is that she will be allowed back into the race. And then in these troubled times, for all the reasons that you've discussed, the way Europe's going, it could be a very interesting presidential election.
And she, of course, has done an awful lot politically to detoxify the brand, hasn't she, from the renaming of the party, National Rally from National Front, to a softening of her approach on things like immigration. Still tough, of course, but not as tough as it once was, and certainly a warmer approach towards the European Union. At one point, of course, they were for Frexit, but that's no longer their official policy. So the idea, Jim, that you put forward that we may actually have support for Le Pen as president in 2028, I don't think is too far-fetched at all. Interestingly, of course, to see the world leaders who immediately came out in favour of Le Pen and supported her. Donald Trump, I think, was one of the first. Erdogan was another. So she's not necessarily run alongside people that we would think are great bedfellows, but there you go. It's populists sticking together, I suppose. And there's an awful lot of time to see where this particular discussion, debate and vote goes in France, but Macron hasn't covered himself in glory, has he, in recent times? And there's still turmoil within Parliament, still struggling to get budgets through from time to time. I know
Well,
the
he
French Prime
can't
Minister
stand
came
again,
out, didn't
can
he?
he?
The French Prime Minister came out actually and criticised the judgment. So, yeah, a lot to play for, but I don't think you could rule out Le Pen becoming president in 2028, Joe, do you?
No, I think you know the court has played into the wrong hands, and they could have just fined her. They could have, but what the way out of it is to hurry up with the appeal process, and then she can appeal. They can say, well, it still stands, but yes, all right, you've served your. I mean, she could have gone to prison actually.
Yeah.
And it's not like lining your pocket. It isn't right, but it is like using House of Commons offices, phones and stationery for party business. It's that level. And when we know the gravy chain that the European Parliament is, it does seem a little bit picking on the wrong person. But who's going to take over from Macron to stand against her? Because that's more interesting, actually.
Yeah.
It's the Democratic Forum of Democratic Europe, the European Parliament.
Well, even Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the hard left, said it was an extreme sentence. So she has managed to unite people who think it was a political move. And I think the problem is at the moment everything is so febrile and people are so touchy that anything can be seen or interpreted as a political move against your opponents.
Okay, and talking about moves against political opponents, what do we make of Israel's decision to bar entry to two Labour MPs from Israel this week? Jim, I'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, I mean, just to restate my position, I believe in the right of Israel to exist within safe borders and not be attacked by its neighbours. And I obviously, like everybody, any sane person, condemn the events of October the 7th, which triggered this awful war. But almost since that atrocity on the Israeli people, Netanyahu has greatly diminished the reputation of Israel in a number of respects, not least this recent horrific case where 15 aid workers were killed, and almost equally horrific, the crude attempt to cover it up by burying the vehicles and the bodies in the sand and denying the lights were on and all this sort of stuff. So I'm sorry, that's not an answer to your question. But on this,
well, it is, Jim, and they weren't aid workers; they were paramedics, they were ambulances.
Yeah. So
present,
So on top of that, we then get the banning of these MPs. I mean, Israel's great strength in the argument in the Middle East is a shining democracy surrounded by states that are autocratic, but its democratic credentials are diminished by doing things like this. Obviously the women concerned, I don't know them. Emily Thornberry, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, yesterday said they were two very bright young Labour women. I believe they were on a fact-finding mission, and I just think it was wrong of Israel to ban them. Israel's obviously very sensitive about criticism at the moment, but this just is counterproductive.
Joe?
Well, so the women were called Yang and Abtisam Mohammed. two Labour MPs, and they were there not as a parliamentary part of a parliamentary delegation. They were there as part of CABU, the Council for Anglo-British Arab-British Understanding and Medical Aid for Palestinians. So they'd organised the trip, these two organisations. So it was a semi-official. They weren't just there. Do you remember Priti Patel when she was Foreign Secretary? Just hopped over to Israel unsanctioned. And you would think, wouldn't you, that actually, okay, you let them in, they go about their business, they do the work that they want to do. But given that Israel won't even allow the BBC or any other major news organisations into Gaza, and hasn't done since October the 7th, which includes, people like Jeremy Bowen and Elise Doucette and various other people. But I was listening on the radio this morning to yet another Israeli brigadier saying, well, we think those people, those paramedics were, they were Hamas terrorists. If you thought they were Hamas terrorists, then why did you, A, lie about them looking dodgy with no lights and no flashing lights on, which turned out to be a complete lie? Why did you tie them up, handcuff them and shoot them one by one? And why did you then try and bury them and their ambulances in a shallow grave with a bulldozer? Why didn't you take them, arrest them? And I don't know, I was seething as I was driving along thinking, how much more? You just said in the first half of this podcast, Frank, that we're standing by and sleepwalking into America becoming an authoritarian state. When is the world going to wake up to what Israel is doing and say enough? Because what they're doing to the Palestinians is genocide. And it is utterly, utterly abhorrent. And, we hear this morning that there are a handful of British people who went over to fight for Israel, who are now back in this country, I believe, who are, and documents have been handed over to the Met to look at whether they are guilty of war crimes against civilians. And we don't even know the half of it, because, as I say, they won't let independent journalists go in and have a look at what's happening in Gaza. So this actually, although it was awful for the two MPs involved, and it's a terrible diplomatic faux pas, actually maybe it raises the issue again that people might finally say, hang on, we can have nothing to do with Israel all the time Netanyahu is there.
Or with Hamas, who should release the remaining hostages.
Well, or with Hamas, but Hamas is prescribed in this country and many others and named as a terrorist organisation. But, we've got this...
No, but that might help the situation if Hamas released the remaining hostages.
Yeah.
Yeah, listen, we've always said on this podcast how hellishly difficult it is because of the enormous difficulties that exist within that part of the world, and it's been the case for too many years now. But what I would say is that to exclude members of the British Parliament from entering your country is at the very best a diplomatic faux pas, but at worst a further demonstration that under the leadership of Netanyahu, you basically are, this is my fear with the United States, getting to the point where if you don't agree to take the knee to him and his leadership, then you'll be excluded from the conversation. And that's not a democracy, I'm afraid. And you mentioned, Jim, that Israel has been seen as the democratic beacon of the Middle East. Well, I'm afraid that the claim to that particular medal is fast waning. And so at some point, when the world hopefully does begin to calm down, we're fast approaching the Donald Trump 100 days, so let's hope he runs out of steam at some point. Countries, people will start to look at what Netanyahu and his mob have been up to. And as bad as Hamas is, and we would all condemn Hamas and the terrorist atrocities that took place on Israelis, and we all want those hostages to be released, it is all about response. And I think that, again, we would all agree on this podcast that the response of the Netanyahu government has not been proportionate, and that is what I think will be condemned ultimately.
Yeah, and just to say, obviously, we had our disagreements in the first part about the caricaturing of the United States administration. But I would certainly say that one of the reasons why Netanyahu is expanding his operation in Gaza is because he's been given the green light by Trump. You know, in the past, under Biden to some extent, there was an attempt, and other American presidents, there was an attempt to rein in Israel. But Trump's clearly given Netanyahu a free pass to do what he wants.
Yeah, there was some checks and balances there that aren't in place at this moment in time, seemingly. So, don't really want to end on that depressing note. So what should we do next? Should we get the ball out, Jim? Because did Plymouth win a game at the weekend?
We did. We beat the Canaries 2-1, Norwich City. With my glass half empty approach to these things, I'm afraid I said it's too little too late, which it almost statistically is. But it was good to see Ryan Hardy score 2 goals, and we just hope we can keep him in the first division next season.
We like giving these weekly updates to people about the Argyle.
They need to have it. They need to have it, particularly because Savage, you know, what's he called, Macclesfield manager, who I've got, Robbie Savage, who I've got a great deal of respect for and what he's done for Macclesfield, who are soaring up through the lower leagues again. He's always rude about us. He said Plymouth reserves beat Liverpool. And then he said, he was talking about Ipswich, and said, to Chris Sutton, who's a Norwich fan, I see even you were beaten by Plymouth, and his sort of lip is curling. It really annoys me. Come on, Robbie, let's.
Well, I can top that on the
anyway, yeah, let's hear Joe's story. This is what football's all about.
Whitstable Town. They are going to Wembley, so we are known as the Oystermen, or the team is. So that's the FA Vase semi-final, second leg yesterday at Hartpury University, and they are now going to Wembley next month with AFC Whiteleaf. And I can tell you, the town is so excited. We're even putting up with the tourists that are clogging up the streets because the sun's come out.
And they'll come out of their shell, presumably, the Oystermen, to win.
Well, it's a pearl. It's a pearl, Jim.
Ah!
Right. Well, on that note, we will end this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast. Thanks for joining us, Heather. We'll be back in 7 days' time, hopefully, with Martin Liftrot joining us with his views on what's going on across the pond. Perhaps a little bit more of a calm approach from Martin than you got from me in the first part of this week's podcast. Have a great week, everyone. We'll see you again next Monday.